beneath a quiet limestone hill in southeastern Anatolia, something older than kings, older than writing, and older than the first cities was waiting in the dark. Massive stone pillars, carved with foxes, snakes, vultures, and wild beasts, had been buried by the very people who built them more than 10,000 years ago. Why would hunter-gatherers create a monument before farming, before empires, before civilization itself? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of ancient mystery you enjoy, the hill does not look like the beginning of a revolution. It rises quietly from the limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia, a rounded swell of earth and stone under a wide sky, with dry grass bending in the wind and distant ridges fading into dust-blue light. For generations, it could have passed as another worn mound in a landscape filled with old traces, a place where shepherds might guide their animals, where farmers might notice broken flints in the soil, where the past seems close but not yet willing to speak. Yet beneath that ordinary surface lies something far older than the first palaces, older than the first kings, older than writing, older than the cities of Mesopotamia. Hidden under the mound are rings of carved stone pillars, some rising taller than a person, arranged with a precision that feels deliberate, formal, and strangely confident. They were not built by an empire. They were not built by a known civilization. They were built by people living near the edge of a new world, more than 10,000 years ago, when the Ice Age had only recently loosened its grip and humanity had not yet become what it later imagined itself to be. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the mystery beneath these ruins is not simply that ancient people built something impressive. The deeper mystery is that they built it before many of the things that were once thought necessary for monument building even existed. For a long time, the story of civilization seemed orderly enough. First came farming, then villages, then surplus food, then social hierarchy, then temples and monuments. People settled down, produced more than they needed, organized labor, invented ritual architecture, and slowly built the first complex societies. That sequence was never as simple as it sounded, but it offered a comfortable ladder from small bands of hunter-gatherers to cities, states, and written history. Then places like Göbekli Tepe complicated the ladder. They suggested that huge ceremonial structures could appear before fully developed village life, before pottery in the region, before domesticated animals became the foundation of daily survival, and before any ruler's name could be carved into stone. The first sight of the pillars changes the feeling of the hill entirely. They are shaped like enormous T's, their broad tops resting on upright shafts, some with carved arms, belts, hands, and symbolic details that make them seem almost human without becoming human faces. Around them are walls of smaller stones, benches, floors, and enclosures, creating spaces that feel enclosed from ordinary life. Animals move across the stone in relief: foxes, snakes, wild boars, cranes, scorpions, vultures, and other creatures of the living landscape. They're not casual decorations. They seem placed with care, and they carry a tension that survives even after thousands of years underground. The fox crouches with alert cunning. The snake coils like a line of danger. Birds stretch long necks in rigid, watchful poses. What these images meant remains uncertain, and scholars still debate whether they belong to myths, clans, warnings, rituals, seasonal gatherings, or a symbolic system whose grammar is now lost. What survives in the record suggests a world both familiar and deeply alien. The people who built these enclosures knew stone, animals, seasons, movement, and memory. They understood the behavior of wild herds and the timing of plants. They made finely worked flint tools and lived in a landscape rich with wild cereals. Pistachio, almond, gazelle, aurochs, and countless smaller resources. They were not primitive in the careless sense that word is sometimes used. They were anatomically and mentally modern humans, skilled observers, social negotiators, and makers of meaning. But they did not leave behind texts explaining why they hauled limestone pillars from nearby bedrock, shaped them, carved them, and raised them in circles. No inscription tells us who stood there or what they believed was happening when people gathered inside. The evidence remains incomplete, and the silence is part of the power of the place. There is also the matter of concealment. These structures were not simply abandoned and left to collapse under rain, wind, and time. Many of the enclosures appear to have been deliberately filled in with rubble, debris, animal bones, broken tools, and earth. The act of burial may have taken enormous effort, perhaps almost as much care as construction itself. That choice creates one of the site's most haunting contradictions. Why would people cover such labour-intensive monuments? Why hide the very spaces their communities had invested so much energy in creating? It may have been a practical act after the structures lost their function. It may have been ritual closure, a way of ending the life of a sacred place. It may have reflected changing beliefs, changing settlement patterns, or a transformation in the relationship between people and the landscape. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the mound remains in part a monument to deliberate forgetting. The land around the hill makes the mystery feel even larger. Today, the region is dry, open, and sun-struck. But 10,000 years ago it was part of a shifting post-Ice Age environment. The great cold had retreated. Glaciers far to the north were shrinking. Rainfall patterns were changing. Wild grasses spread across parts of the Fertile Crescent, and communities moved through territories that offered both abundance and uncertainty. In this world, people were not merely surviving day to day. They were gathering, exchanging knowledge, making alliances, perhaps competing for prestige, perhaps binding themselves through ceremonies that required food, labour, and shared attention. The hilltop would have been visible from a distance, a natural marker in a landscape already rich with meaning. Long before stone walls rose there, the place may have mattered. What is most unsettling is not that the builders were capable of carving stone. Human beings had been making art, tools, ornaments, and ritual objects for tens of thousands of years before this. The unsettling part is the scale and coordination. Large pillars had to be quarried, shaped, transported, raised upright, and integrated into planned spaces. This demanded cooperation beyond a single household. It required memory of a design, shared purpose, and probably repeated gatherings. If the people who came here were still strongly connected to mobile foraging lifeways, then the site may reveal a form of social complexity that does not fit neatly into older categories. It suggests that the roots of civilization may not lie only in fields and granaries, but also in gathering places, in ceremonies, in the shared emotional force of standing before carved symbols whose meanings everyone present may have felt, even if no one wrote them down. The ruins under the mound therefore do something rare. They push the beginning of the story backward while also making it less certain. They do not simply announce that civilization began earlier than expected. They suggest that civilization may not have begun in one clean step at all. It may have emerged through overlapping experiments, ritual before temple, gathering before town, wild harvest before farming, memory before history, monument before kingdom. Beneath the ancient ruins is not just stone architecture, it is a challenge buried in earth, asking why human beings first chose to bind themselves to places, symbols, and shared labour on a scale that exceeded immediate survival. The hill keeps most of its answers hidden, but even its silence has changed the shape of the human past. Long before anyone carves a king's name into clay, long before tax collectors, city walls, royal tombs, or temple archives, the world around the old hill is already changing. The change is not sudden in the way later histories like to imagine suddenness. No single morning divides the age of wandering from the age of settlement. No one wakes beneath a skin shelter and decides that history has begun. Instead, the transformation comes unevenly, season by season, valley by valley. Through choices so practical they may not feel revolutionary at all. A group returns to a patch of wild grain because it ripens reliably. Families remember where gazelle passed during migration. People gather near springs, oak groves, pistachio stands, and limestone ridges where flint can be struck into sharp blades. A place becomes familiar, then useful, then meaningful, and finally difficult to leave behind. The world after the Ice Age is not empty wilderness waiting for civilization to arrive. It is already a human world, though not yet an urban one. For tens of thousands of years, human beings have crossed continents, adapted to cold steppes and warm coasts, painted animals deep inside caves, buried their dead with ornaments, and carried stories through landscapes that leave only faint traces in the soil. By the time the great monuments beneath the Anatolian mound are built, people are not new to imagination, ritual, or planning. They are heirs to an older human inheritance. What changes now is the relationship between mobility and place. The climate is shifting. The old glacial world weakens. Forests and grasslands rearrange themselves. Herd animals change their ranges. The rhythms of rain and drought become both opportunity and threat. In the Fertile Crescent, wild cereals grow in dense stands in some regions, offering a food source that can be harvested in quantity without yet being domesticated. It is not farming as later villages understand it, but it begins to blur the line between gathering and cultivation. The people living through this transition do not think of themselves as prehistoric. They live in a present crowded with knowledge. They know how stone fractures under pressure, how bone can become a point, how sinew tightens, how hides cure, how fire changes food and wood and stone. They know which plants must be eaten quickly, which can be stored, which heal, which poison, and which return after rain. Their maps are not drawn on parchment, but they are carried in memory, in repeated journeys. In stories attached to ridges, springs, caves, and animal paths. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests communities far more socially and intellectually complex than the old stereotype of simple wandering bands. They exchange materials across distance. They decorate bodies. They bury some individuals with care. They gather in places that are not merely camps. Their world is organized by movement, but movement does not mean aimlessness. One of the lesser-known details of this age is how much of its transformation may have depended on storage. A basket, a pit, a plastered floor, a dry corner protected from rodents and dampness can change the future as surely as a plough. When food can be gathered in a season and kept beyond that season, people are pulled into new patterns of time. They can remain longer near certain places. They can feed guests. They can support labour that does not immediately produce food. They can survive lean weeks with less movement. Storage is not glamorous, and it rarely survives well in the archaeological record, but it may be one of the quiet foundations beneath more visible revolutions. A carved pillar stands in sunlight and draws the eye. A hidden store of grain, nuts, or dried meat may explain how enough people found the time to raise it. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for this transition. Climate matters, but climate alone does not build monuments. Food abundance matters, but abundance does not automatically produce ritual architecture. Population pressure may have played a role in some places, but it cannot be applied everywhere like a simple formula. Scholars still debate how much early communities were pushed by environmental stress and how much they were pulled by new social possibilities. The end of the last ice age creates openings, but human beings decide what to do with those openings. They return to certain locations, they intensify harvests, they cooperate, compete, marry, feast, remember, mourn, and mark the land. The ruins under the mound belong to this world of experiments, where no one yet lives under a state, but people are already discovering that shared places can hold power. There is an important danger in looking backward from later civilization. It is tempting to treat these people as incomplete farmers or unfinished villagers, as though their lives are only meaningful because they lead eventually to fields, towns, and empires. That view flattens them. Many of these communities are expert foragers, not failed agriculturalists. Their mobility is a strategy, not a deficiency. They live with a flexibility that later settled people often lose. They can follow resources, avoid exhausted ground, and maintain wide social networks. Their knowledge of the landscape is intimate and practical, and their symbolic life may be just as rich as that of later societies with temples and writing. What makes the period so fascinating is not a simple march toward progress, but a gradual narrowing of choices. As people invest more labor in places, as food sources are managed more intensively, as ritual centers become more important, leaving becomes more complicated. The old hill, then, is not floating outside its time. It is part of a broader reshaping of human life across Western Asia. In the Levant, communities associated with the Natufian tradition have already built more substantial settlements in some areas before full agriculture. They collect wild cereals, hunt gazelle, use grinding stones, and sometimes bury the dead near or beneath the places where the living continue to gather. Farther north, in the uplands and plains near the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, similar pressures and possibilities unfold in their own local forms. The details differ from region to region, and the evidence is patchy. But a larger pattern appears. Human groups are beginning to anchor memory in place more strongly than before. Under this light, the 10,000-year-old mystery becomes less like an isolated miracle, and more like a visible peak in a buried landscape of change. The carved pillars are extraordinary, but they rise from a world already full of accumulated habits, seasonal knowledge, and social ties. They belong to a time before kings, yet not before authority of every kind. Elders, ritual specialists, skilled hunters, master flint workers, persuasive hosts, or keepers of stories may have shaped decisions in ways that leave no titles behind. They belong to a time before writing, yet not before memory. The absence of text does not mean the absence of history. It means the history has to be read in harder materials, stone cuts, animal bones, floor surfaces, post holes, plant remains, burial patterns, and the strange decision to return again and again to a hill where the landscape itself seems to wait. The most difficult thing to accept about the builders is not their age, but their social position in the old story. They are hunters, gatherers, foragers, people whose lives are still tied to wild animals, wild plants, seasonal movement, and knowledge carried in the body rather than stored in written records. They live before metal tools in this region, before the wheel, before draft animals, before pottery becomes common in daily life. yet the stones they raise do not feel tentative. They are not small markers placed casually in the ground. They are shaped pillars, arranged spaces, carved surfaces, and planned enclosures, made with a confidence that forces the old categories to bend. If monumentality once seemed to belong naturally to kings and cities, these ruins show another possibility. People without palaces can still organize labor around something larger than immediate survival. The limestone itself helps explain how the work is possible, but not why it happens. The bedrock near the hill provides a natural source of pillar stone, and unfinished pieces and quarry traces suggest that builders cut directly from the living rock. They do not need to drag stone from mountains far away, but that should not make the achievement seem easy. A pillar weighing several tons still has to be detached, shaped, moved, lifted, and secured without pulleys, iron chisels, or domesticated oxen. The work depends on stone tools, wooden levers, ropes of plant fibre or hide, packed earth ramps, careful teamwork, and repeated trial. What survives in the record suggests people who understand both material and method. There is a strange intimacy in imagining the work before the finished monument exists. The hilltop is not yet a buried sacred place, not yet an archaeological site, not yet a symbol in modern debates about civilization. It is a work zone filled with dust, chipped stone, bodies, and concentration. Flint blades bite into surfaces, hammerstones strike, limestone flakes scatter underfoot. Someone studies the line of a pillar before another blow falls. Others clear rubble, carry baskets, or prepare food for those working through the day. The air smells of crushed stone, sweat, smoke, and dry grass. Gazelle move in the lower distance. The living world watches the making of another kind of world, one that will not run, grow, or migrate, but will remain fixed in place. The absence of obvious royal authority makes the organization behind the labor harder to see. Later monuments often arrive with evidence of coercion, taxation, hierarchy, or administration. Here, the traces are more elusive. No palace stands beside the enclosures. No storehouse filled with written accounts names the workers. No ruler appears on the stone demanding obedience. This does not mean there is no leadership. Large work almost always requires coordination. There may have been respected ritual figures, skilled planners, persuasive elders, powerful lineages, competitive groups, or temporary leaders whose authority rose during gathering seasons and faded afterward. Scholars still debate how formal this authority was, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the stones make one thing difficult to deny: someone could gather people, hold their attention, and direct their energy toward a shared design. That design is one of the most surprising details. The enclosures are not random clusters of uprights. The larger spaces often contain paired central T-shaped pillars, with smaller pillars set around them in surrounding walls. This arrangement creates a sense of focus, as though the room itself is turned inward toward a central presence. The T-shapes may represent stylized human forms, especially where arms, hands, belts, and garment-like details appear carved along the shafts. Yet their heads are blank crossbars, without faces, without eyes, without individual expression. They are human and not human at the same time. They stand like figures reduced to essence, bodies transformed into architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for their meaning. The builders' lives outside the hill are just as important as the pillars themselves. They are not peasants leaving farms to perform occasional temple duty. They likely live by hunting wild game, collecting plants, processing nuts and grasses, making tools, and moving through a landscape of known resources. Gazelle, wild cattle, boar, deer, birds, and other animals are not background decoration. They are food, danger, skill, story, and symbol. Hunting is not merely a way to fill the stomach. It can shape prestige, cooperation, identity, and ritual imagination. A feast made from wild game can become more than a meal. It can become a social contract. One lesser-known clue lies in the sheer amount of debris associated with activity around such sites: broken flints, animal bones, rubble, and the ordinary waste of extraordinary gatherings. These remains hint that monument building is not a silent, purely spiritual event separated from daily life. It may be bound to food preparation, tool production, repair, exchange, and social display. People come together, and when people come together, they eat, negotiate, compete, remember debts, arrange marriages, exchange stories, and measure themselves against one another. A carved pillar may express a shared belief, but the work of raising it may also create the community that believes in it. This is where the old sequence of civilization begins to loosen. For many years, it seemed natural to assume that large ritual architecture required settled agricultural surplus. Farmers produce extra grain. Extra grain supports specialists. Specialists build temples, and temples anchor complex society. But at sites like Göbekli Tepe, the order appears less obedient. The monument may come before full farming. Ritual gathering may help intensify the use of nearby wild cereals. Cooperation around stone may encourage people to remain near certain places longer than before. Feasting may require predictable food supplies. Predictable food supplies may push communities toward cultivation. The evidence does not prove a simple reversal, and scholars still debate the timing and direction of influence. The hunters who build monuments therefore stand at a threshold. They are not city dwellers, but they are no longer easily described as scattered bands moving lightly across the land. Their labour is heavy. Their symbols are durable. Their gatherings leave marks deep enough for archaeologists to find after 10,000 years. They show that human beings can become monument builders before they become subjects, before they become taxpayers, before they become citizens of any named place. Under the ancient hill, the first great surprise is not stone. It is the discovery that the desire to gather around meaning may be older than the systems later built to control it. The hill becomes stranger when the builders are no longer only builders. At some point after pillars have been raised, after walls have been fitted around them, after animals have been carved into the limestone and gatherings have taken place in the shadow of these silent forms, people return with another purpose. They do not simply leave the enclosures open to weather and ruin. They begin to cover them, stone by stone, basket by basket, with rubble, broken tools, animal bones, soil, and debris. They fill the spaces that earlier hands had worked so hard to create. The sacred rooms, if sacred is the right word, are gradually swallowed. The tall pillars disappear into packed material. Carved foxes and snakes vanish from sight. The hill rises over them like a lid. This deliberate burial is one of the most haunting parts of the mystery. Abandonment is easy to understand. People move, resources shift, beliefs change, buildings collapse when no one repairs them. But burial requires action. It demands labour, organisation, and intention. The same communities, or their descendants, seem to have spent time closing these places off from the living world. That does not mean every enclosure was buried in one grand ceremony, and the evidence remains incomplete. Some filling may have happened in stages. Some may have involved cleaning, dumping, rebuilding, or repurposing. Yet the overall result is hard to ignore. Spaces designed for gathering were transformed into hidden chambers beneath a growing mound. To stand inside the idea of that act is to feel its weight. The people who filled the enclosures must have known what they were covering. They were not burying anonymous stones. They were burying carved pillars that may have held memory, identity, danger, reverence, or ancestral meaning. Perhaps older people remembered ceremonies there. Perhaps children had been told not to enter certain spaces. Perhaps hunters had returned from distant ground and found the old enclosure already half filled, its central pillars sinking into the earth like figures being pulled back into another world. The work may have been solemn, practical, hurried, or routine. No one can say for certain. Scholars still debate whether the burial was ritual closure, ordinary refuse disposal, structural maintenance, or a mixture of all three. The material used to fill the spaces deepens the puzzle. It is not clean sand poured gently over a shrine. It contains rubble, flint fragments, animal bones, and domestic-looking waste, the messy remains of lives lived around the site. At first, that might seem to make the burial less mysterious, as though the enclosures simply became convenient holes for garbage. But even refuse can carry meaning. In ancient societies, the line between sacred deposit and discarded waste is not always sharp. Bones from feasts, broken tools, and fragments of daily activity can become part of a closing act. What looks like rubbish to the modern eye may once have marked the end of use, the return of a structure to the earth, or the sealing of a place whose power was not meant to remain exposed forever. There is another possibility, quieter but equally powerful. The builders may have believed that these places had life cycles. A monument could be born, used, renewed, and then ended. Its burial might not be destruction at all, but completion. Later societies sometimes dismantle temples, seal tombs, or cover old ritual spaces when their meaning changes. At Göbekli Tepe, something similar may have occurred without kings, priests in written robes, or official decrees. The community may have understood that an enclosure belonged to a certain generation, a certain gathering, a certain memory, or a certain relationship with the dead and the wild landscape. When that relationship changed, the monument was not left as an empty shell. It was closed. The act also protected the ruins in a way no one could have intended for modern archaeology. Because the pillars were buried, many survived with carvings still visible after more than 10,000 years. Wind did not erase them completely. Later builders did not quarry all of them away. Rain did not wear every animal into shapelessness. The very act that hid the site also preserved it. This is one of the dry ironies of archaeology. Forgetting can become a form of conservation. A place sealed away from memory may speak more clearly to the distant future than a place continuously used and rebuilt until its earliest layers vanish. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for the burial. If it was purely practical dumping, why were such important spaces used in that way? If it was purely ritual, why does the fill contain such mixed debris? If it was meant to erase the past, why were the stones not smashed more thoroughly? If it was meant to preserve the past, why leave no sign above ground clear enough to be remembered? Each answer solves one part and leaves another part exposed. The mystery is not a blank wall, but a wall full of cracks, and through each crack a different version of the past appears. As the hill grows higher, the landscape changes around it. The open enclosures become buried architecture. The place that once may have drawn people toward visible pillars becomes a mound whose meaning is stored beneath the surface. Time adds its own covering dust, grass, memory loss, later footsteps, the slow rearrangement of human life. New ways of living spread through the region. Villages become more permanent. Plants and animals move closer to domestication. The world that produced the first great stone circles does not vanish overnight, but it shifts enough that the old hill no longer speaks in the same way. That is why the burial matters so deeply. It shows that the mystery is not only about creation, but also about ending. These people did not merely build beyond what modern observers once expected of them. They also chose, somehow, and for reasons still debated, to hide what they had made, beneath the mound. The ruins are not frozen at the moment of construction. They are caught in a longer human drama making meaning, gathering around it, feeding it with labour, and then sealing it away when its time has passed. The hill is therefore not just a monument. It is a memory deliberately covered by the hands of those who may have understood it best. Once the enclosures are uncovered, the animals begin to stare back across the ages. They are cut into limestone with a force that feels sharper than decoration. A fox stretches along the side of a pillar, lean and watchful, its body caught between movement and warning. Snakes coil and slide in repeated forms, sometimes clustered like a living surface. Wild boars appear heavy and aggressive, with bristling energy still trapped in stone. Birds stand with long legs and pointed beaks, some resembling cranes or vultures, others harder to identify after thousands of years of wear. There are scorpions, spiders, aurochs, gazelle, and creatures whose exact species remain debated. They gather across the pillars like fragments of a language whose words survive but whose grammar has been lost. The first temptation is to read them as simple scenes from nature, as though the builders carved the animals they saw around them, because those animals filled their world. That is partly true. These were not imaginary beasts from a fantasy landscape. They belong to the real environment of the early Holocene, to the hills, plains, wetlands, and open country surrounding the upper Euphrates and Tigris regions. The people who made the carvings knew these creatures intimately. They knew the speed of gazelle, the danger of wild cattle, the habits of boar in thickets, the sudden movement of snakes near rocks, the cry of birds overhead. Yet the carvings do not behave like a natural history catalogue. They seem selected, arranged, and emphasized in ways that suggest symbolic meaning. What survives in the record suggests a world where animals were not merely food or danger, but signs through which people thought about power, death, identity, and the unseen order of things. Some carvings appear almost confrontational. Predators and dangerous animals are common, while clearly domesticated creatures are absent, because domestication is not yet the centre of life here. The wild world dominates the stone. This matters. Later temple art in farming societies often shows controlled animals, harvests, herds, or gods associated with settled abundance. At Göbekli Tepe, the animals are still untamed. They bite, creep, watch, and threaten. They belong to a world not yet brought fully under human management. If the central T-shaped pillars represent stylized human figures, then those human-like forms are surrounded by wild forces. The arrangement may express mastery, fear, relationship, or transformation. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the emotional charge is difficult to miss. The fox is especially striking. Foxes appear again and again in the imagery of Göbekli Tepe and nearby early Neolithic sites, and their importance remains uncertain. They are clever animals, difficult to catch, active in the edges between open land and cover, between daylight and night. In many later traditions across the world, foxes become tricksters, boundary crossers, and creatures associated with cunning. But it would be careless to project later myths directly backward into this world. Scholars still debate what the fox meant to these communities. It may have been linked to particular groups, stories, ritual roles, hunting knowledge, or qualities admired and feared. Its repeated presence suggests significance, but the meaning itself stays just out of reach. The birds carry a different kind of unease. Vultures and crane-like figures appear in several early sites in the region, and they may connect to ideas about death, sky, and the treatment of bodies. At some Neolithic settlements, human remains show complex burial practices, including the removal, handling, and sometimes special treatment of skulls. The exact connection between these practices and the bird carvings cannot be proven in a simple way, but the association is difficult to ignore. Vultures consume flesh and lift what remains into the air, making them powerful symbols in many death-related systems, though again, caution is necessary. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, when a vulture-like bird appears beside human elements or other threatening creatures, the stone seems to carry a memory of mortality. One of the most famous carved scenes includes a headless human figure, a bird, and a scorpion-like creature on a pillar often discussed by archaeologists because it feels unusually narrative. It does not tell a story in the modern sense, and no one can translate it like a written inscription. Yet it seems to place beings in relation to one another, as if recording an event, a mythic image, a warning, or a ritual idea. The headless human form is especially unsettling, not because it invites sensational claims, but because head removal and skull treatment are known from several early Neolithic contexts. This does not mean the carving proves a specific ceremony. It means the image belongs to a broader world where the dead, the body, and the separation of the head may have carried meanings that later observers can only partly reconstruct. The animals may also have marked social identities. Groups arriving from different territories could have recognized themselves through particular creatures, much as later communities use emblems, clan signs, or totems. A boar, fox, snake, or bird might have represented a lineage, a hunting group, a remembered ancestor, or a relationship with a part of the landscape. This idea is plausible, but not settled. The difficulty is that symbols can serve many purposes at once. An animal can be food, danger, ancestor, spirit, sign of season, and group marker without fitting neatly into a single category. Modern interpretation often wants one answer. Ancient symbols may not have worked that way. There is also the question of visibility. These carvings were placed on pillars inside enclosures, where people would have seen them in controlled spaces, perhaps by daylight entering from above, perhaps by firelight during gatherings. In shifting light, the reliefs would have seemed more alive. Shadows would sharpen the curve of a snake, the ribs of a fox, the body of a boar. The stones may not have been passive objects. They may have been part of a performed environment, activated by movement. Sound, smell, food, smoke, and the presence of many bodies. The carvings were not museum images. They belong to moments. That may be the most important clue. The animals are not only pictures from a lost belief system, they are survivors of experiences that included everything archaeology struggles to recover: gestures, chants, silence, fear, memory, hunger, pride, and the pressure of standing with others in a charged place. Their meanings are hidden, but their intensity remains. Beneath the ruins, the old wild world has not disappeared. It has been fixed into stone, surrounding the human-shaped pillars like a warning from the time before fields, before herds, before cities learned to place walls between themselves and the dark. If the pillars are the bones of the mystery, ritual may be its breath. The people who gather on the hill are not arriving at a village temple in the later sense, with fields surrounding them, storage rooms nearby, and a settled population living under the shadow of a permanent shrine. They may be coming from scattered camps, seasonal territories, smaller settlements, hunting grounds, and river valleys, drawn together by something powerful enough to interrupt ordinary movement. A place like this does not need walls of a city around it to become central. It becomes central because people agree, repeatedly, that it matters. They walk toward it across a landscape they know by memory. They bring food, tools, stories, bodies, obligations and expectations. They may arrive as kin, allies, rivals, guests, or strangers whose presence must be managed carefully. The monument does not simply reflect community. It may help create community. Ritual before the village is difficult to imagine because later history teaches the eye to look for fixed institutions. Temples have priests, cities have gates, kingdoms have rulers, villages have houses, fields, ovens, refuse pits, and family spaces. But in the world of the early Holocene, formal institutions may be only beginning to take shape, if they exist at all. Ceremony can still be organized without written doctrine. Authority can still be real without a throne. A gathering can still be sacred without a permanent congregation. What survives in the record suggests events that may have brought people together through repeated acts: building, carving, eating, remembering, burying, watching, and perhaps entering restricted spaces where the arrangement of stone and image separated ordinary life from another kind of experience. Feasting may have been one of the strongest forces holding these gatherings together. Food has always carried meanings beyond hunger. A shared meal can settle tension, display generosity, create debts, celebrate success, mark a death, seal an alliance, or show that one group has the power to host another. Around Göbekli Tepe and related places, animal bones suggest the large-scale consumption of wild game, especially gazelle in some contexts, alongside other species. This does not prove one specific ceremony, but it points toward gatherings where food was prepared and consumed in quantities that may exceed daily household needs. Scholars still debate how regular these feasts were, how large they became, and whether they were attached directly to monument construction, seasonal meetings, funerary rites, or several activities at once. The important point is that feasting requires coordination. Animals must be hunted, plants must be gathered, fuel must be collected, tools must be made and repaired, meat must be butchered, cooked, shared, and disposed of. If people arrive from different places, someone must decide who receives what, who eats first, who hosts, who contributes, and who leaves with honor or resentment. Such details rarely survive in archaeology, but they shape social life. A feast can appear generous while also creating obligation. The one who gives food gains influence. The group that contributes labor gains standing. The people who gather repeatedly around the same hill may begin to imagine themselves as part of a wider world than their ordinary camp or lineage. Belief may have deepened that bond. The carvings do not show simple domestic comfort. They are filled with wild animals, danger, watchfulness, and forms that seem human without becoming portraits. The enclosures themselves may have created a controlled atmosphere, with central pillars rising like presences in the middle. Entering such a space may have been emotionally intense. The air could have held smoke, dust, the smell of cooked meat, crushed plants, and many bodies standing close together. Firelight may have shifted across the reliefs, making snakes appear to move and foxes sharpen at the edges. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened there, but it is hard to see these places as purely practical buildings. Their design suggests attention to experience, not just shelter. One lesser-known possibility is that the work itself may have been part of the ritual. Modern observers often separate construction from ceremony, as if the sacred moment begins only after the building is finished. In early communities, that separation may not have existed. Quarrying a pillar, shaping it, dragging it, raising it, and carving it could have been charged acts. The labour may have bound participants together through exhaustion, danger, skill, and pride. A stone set upright after days or weeks of effort becomes more than an object. It becomes proof that many hands acted as one. It becomes a memory fixed in the ground. This matters because early social complexity may not have needed agriculture as its first engine. It may have grown from the need to gather, perform, and maintain relationships across distance. If ritual centres demanded food, then people may have intensified the harvesting of wild cereals nearby. If feasts required predictable supplies, then storage became more important. If repeated gatherings made certain places prestigious, then remaining near those places became attractive. Farming may not have caused ritual life in a simple one-way sequence. Ritual life may have helped create the conditions in which farming became useful, even necessary. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far this idea can be pushed. But the possibility has changed the way the period is understood. The hill also shows that belief can alter landscapes before economics fully transforms them. To build there is to turn a natural rise into a marked place. To return there is to create tradition. To bury an enclosure is to give memory a physical ending. Each act changes not only the hill but the people connected to it. The scattered communities of the region may have learned, through places like this, how powerful shared attention could be. They may have discovered that a gathering place could organize labour, shape identity, and make people think beyond immediate survival. Yet the mystery remains guarded. There is no surviving chant, no myth written on the stones, no account of who was allowed to enter the enclosures or who had to remain outside. The people who stood there left images but not explanations. Still, the pattern is suggestive. Before the village becomes the centre of life, before domestic herds and cultivated fields dominate the human horizon, a hilltop of carved stone may have drawn people together and taught them a new kind of belonging. The first permanent architecture of meaning may not have grown from the house. It may have grown from the gathering, from the feast, from the ritual moment when scattered lives briefly became one community under the gaze of animals carved in stone. Once people begin returning to the same places again and again, the landscape changes even before houses become permanent. A spring is no longer just water, a grove is no longer just shade and food. A hilltop is no longer just a lookout above the plains. Repetition gives places memory. Paths become worn by feet. Campsites gather ash, stone flakes, bones, and impressions of bodies resting near fires. Storage pits, working floors, and simple shelters may be repaired rather than abandoned. A place that once belonged to a season begins to pull people back with a stronger force, not because movement has ended, but because return has become part of life. The first permanent gatherings are born in that tension between mobility and attachment. Around the ancient hill, this tension may have been especially strong. The wider region offers wild cereals, game animals, water sources, workable stone, and high ground from which people can see across the surrounding country. It is not a city landscape, but it is not empty either. People move through it with purpose, and some places become nodes in a human network. The old enclosures may have drawn groups at particular times of year, perhaps when certain animals migrated, when wild grains ripened, or when social and ritual obligations required people to assemble. Scholars still debate the exact rhythm of these gatherings, but what survives in the record suggests that they were not random visits. The labour invested in stone and the repeated use of the site point toward a place known, revisited, and remembered. The shift from seasonal return to lasting settlement is one of the most important transformations in human history. But it does not happen all at once. For a long time, communities may have lived in mixed ways. Some people remained mobile for part of the year and gathered in more fixed places at other times. Some groups may have built more substantial structures without abandoning hunting and gathering. Others may have stayed near important locations for longer periods, especially when food resources were abundant or when stored supplies allowed them to endure leaner weeks. The evidence remains incomplete because the earliest architecture can be difficult to interpret. A circular building, a sunken floor, a cluster of post holes, or a plastered surface may be domestic, ritual, communal, or all of these at once. This ambiguity matters. Later observers often want to separate life into neat categories: home, temple, workshop, cemetery, storage space. Early Neolithic communities may not have drawn those lines in the same way. A building could be a place of gathering, memory, food preparation, and symbolic action. A floor could hold daily work and the dead beneath it. A hearth could cook ordinary meals and also serve gatherings with social meaning. The first permanent places were not simply practical shelters. They were experiments in living near one another with new intensity. When people remain closer for longer, relationships change. Cooperation becomes more necessary, but so does conflict management. Food sharing becomes more complicated. The dead become part of the same ground the living occupy. Children grow up knowing certain structures not as temporary camps, but as places that have always been there. A surprising detail of this transition is that permanence may have created new problems as much as new comforts. Settled life can look like progress from a distance, but for the people living through it, staying put may have brought crowding, waste, disease risk, disputes over stored food, and pressure on nearby resources. Mobile foragers could often leave a place when it became depleted or socially tense. More settled groups had to solve problems in place. They had to maintain relationships, manage refuse, protect supplies from animals and other humans, and negotiate access to fields or harvesting zones that were not yet fully owned in the later sense. No single explanation fully accounts for why people accepted these difficulties, but ritual centers, reliable food sources, and growing social obligations may all have made certain places harder to abandon. This is where the old hill fits into a wider human story. A gathering place can become a reason to stay near a landscape. If ceremonies happen there, if ancestors are remembered there, if alliances are renewed there, if feasts display generosity and power there, then the surrounding territory becomes more valuable. People may begin to invest in nearby resources with greater care. They may harvest wild grain more intensively, clear competing plants, return seeds unintentionally or deliberately, and protect stands from being consumed too early. They may store food not only for their own households, but for future gatherings. Over generations, these habits can pull people toward a more settled life without anyone naming it as a revolution. The houses and communal buildings of early settlements across the region reveal how deep that change becomes. Walls are rebuilt, floors are resurfaced, buildings are modified rather than simply discarded. Some settlements show repeated construction in the same place, layer upon layer, creating mounds of accumulated occupation. A mound is not only earth, it is lived time made visible. It grows from mud, stone, ash, bone, plaster, and the habit of return at Göbekli Tepe. The mound covers monumental enclosures. Elsewhere, mounds grow from domestic life. Together they show a world in which people are beginning to build upward through memory. Yet the relationship between monument and village remains debated. Did gathering at monumental sites encourage people to settle nearby, or did more settled communities make it possible to build monuments? The answer may not be either one. Different places may have followed different paths, and the processes may have reinforced each other. More frequent gatherings required more food and labour. More reliable food allowed longer stays. Longer stays strengthened attachment to place. Attachment to place encouraged more building. More building made the place harder to forget. What begins as a seasonal focus can become a centre of life. The human cost of this change is easy to miss beneath the grandeur of stone pillars. A world of movement allows identity to be stretched across landscapes. A more settled world gathers identity into narrower ground. People become tied to particular walls, burial places, storage pits, paths, and fields. This can deepen belonging, but it can also sharpen boundaries. Those who belong to a place may begin to distinguish themselves more strongly from those who arrive from elsewhere. Hospitality, suspicion, obligation, and exclusion may all grow together. The first permanent gatherings may have created wider communities, but they also may have created the first stronger lines around them. Beneath the ancient ruins, then, the mystery is not only what people believed, it is how repeated gathering changed the structure of life itself. The hill stands at the edge of a transformation in which place becomes heavier. Memory becomes architectural, and human groups begin to organize themselves around centers that outlast any single season. The first villages do not appear as sudden answers. They emerge from returns, repairs, feasts, burials, stored food, shared labor, and the slow realization that some places have become too meaningful to leave behind completely. The first seeds of the New World do not look like the beginning of agriculture. They are small, dry, easily overlooked, scattered through grasses that bend in the wind on slopes, plains, and open woodland edges. They do not announce themselves as future bread, future tax, future empire, future famine, future wealth. They are simply wild cereals, ripening in their season, familiar to people who have watched them for generations, long before fields are planted in straight lines. People know where grain grows thickly. They know when their heads turn heavy. They know how quickly birds, rodents, insects, and weather can take what humans hope to gather. They cut, pull, beat, winnow, grind, roast, soak, and store. A handful of seeds can be a meal, but many baskets of seeds can become something more dangerous and powerful, a reason to stay. Around the Fertile Crescent, the path from foraging to farming is slow, uneven, and full of experiments that leave only partial traces behind. There is no single inventor of agriculture standing in a field with a sudden idea. There is no clean line between wild harvest and cultivation. People may first encourage useful plants without fully domesticating them. They may return to the same stands year after year, clear away competing vegetation, harvest in ways that favour certain traits, spill seeds near camps, or protect a patch from animals at the right moment. Some of these acts are intentional, others are accidental. Over time, however, repeated human attention changes the plants, and the plants change human life in return. The difference between a wild cereal and a domesticated one can be hidden in tiny details. Wild grain is built to scatter itself. When it ripens, the seed head breaks apart easily, dropping seeds to the ground so the plant can reproduce without human help. Domesticated grain, by contrast, tends to hold its seeds more firmly, which makes it easier for people to harvest. This trait is useful to humans, but less useful to the plant in the wild. Archaeologists look for such changes in charred plant remains, studying fragments that survived in hearths, pits, and occupation layers. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earlier stages, but these small botanical clues reveal a vast transformation unfolding almost invisibly. Near the world of Göbekli Tepe, wild einkorn wheat and other cereals grow in regions that later become central to early farming. That fact has drawn intense attention, because it suggests that the people gathering around monumental sites lived close to some of the plants that would eventually reshape human history. Yet proximity alone does not prove direct cause. Scholars still debate how closely the rise of ritual centers and the domestication of plants were connected. It is possible that gatherings and feasts increased the demand for reliable food, encouraging more intensive harvesting and management. It is also possible that communities already experimenting with plant use had more capacity to gather, build, and host. The relationship may have worked in both directions, a loop rather than a straight line. To understand the force of grain, it helps to imagine the labor behind it. Harvesting wild cereals is not effortless abundance. It takes timing, skill, and group coordination. Cut too early, and the seeds are not ready. Wait too long, and they fall, rot, or are eaten. Once gathered, the grain must be carried, dried, cleaned, ground, and protected. Grinding stones wear down hands, shoulders, and knees. Dust clings to skin. Chaff catches in hair and clothing. A meal of grain contains within it hours of repeated motion. The later world will turn bread into a symbol of settled life, but its origins are not soft. They are gritty, physical, and demanding. Storage changes everything again. Grain can be kept in ways that fresh meat and many gathered plants cannot. It can bridge seasons, support gatherings, feed children, supply travelers, and survive in pits or containers if protected from dampness and animals. But storage also creates risk. Stored food can be stolen. It can attract pests. It can become a source of inequality if some households or groups control more than others. It can tie people to guarded places. A community that stores food has something to defend, something to count, something to promise, and something to lose. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of settled life, but stored plant food almost certainly made certain futures more possible. This may be one of the quiet contradictions beneath the ancient ruins. Monumental gathering can feel spiritual, symbolic, even otherworldly, yet it depends on very earthly logistics. People who come together must be fed. Workers who quarry and raise pillars need calories. Feasts that impress visiting groups require planning. Rituals that last beyond a single day require supply. If wild cereals, nuts, and other plant foods help support these events, then the sacred and the practical become inseparable. A stone pillar may rise because of belief, but belief survives through baskets of food, grinding stones, hearths, and stored seeds. The shift toward cultivation also changes time. Foragers often follow the timing of many different resources across a broad landscape. Early cultivators begin to bind themselves more tightly to the cycle of particular plants. There is a season to prepare, a season to watch, a season to harvest, a season to store. Even before true farming fully develops, plant management teaches patience and expectation. It asks people to imagine future hunger while food is still present. It turns memory into planning. It makes the landscape not only something to move through, but something to return to at the correct moment. Still, it would be wrong to imagine farming as an immediate triumph. Early cultivation may have brought heavier labour, narrower diets, greater dependence on weather, and new vulnerabilities. A bad season could threaten those who had invested too much in one place. Crowding near settlements could increase disease. Stored grain could become both security and burden. What later civilizations celebrated as abundance may have begun as a difficult bargain. People gained predictability, but they gave up some flexibility. They gained heavier attachment to place, but they also inherited new kinds of anxiety. Beneath the old hill, the story of seeds is therefore not separate from the story of stone. Both are about commitment. To carve a pillar is to invest labour in a place. To manage plants is to invest hope in a season that has not yet arrived. To store grain is to believe that the future can be prepared for, though never controlled. The mystery hidden under ancient ruins is not only why people built before cities, it is why, at this moment in deep time, human beings began binding themselves more tightly to chosen places, chosen foods, and chosen memories. The wild grasses of the hills did not force civilization into being, but they offered one of the materials from which it could grow, somewhere between harvest and ceremony, between the grinding stone and the carved pillar. The old mobile world began to root itself. The ruins speak most clearly when the grand stones are placed beside the smallest remains. A carved pillar can dominate the imagination, but the ground around it is filled with quieter evidence, broken flint, butchered bone, ash, fragments of limestone, grinding debris, and the hard-to-romanticize refuse of meals and work. These traces pull the mystery down from the sky and back into human hands. Whatever people believed on the hill, they also had to eat, cut, carry, scrape, sharpen, repair, and clean. The sacred, if that is what the place was, did not float above ordinary life. It was built out of it. Animal bones are among the most revealing clues. They survive where words do not, and they record choices that people may not have thought worth preserving. Around early monumental sites in southeastern Anatolia, the bones of wild animals appear in large quantities, especially gazelle in some contexts, along with wild cattle, boar, sheep, goats, birds, and other creatures depending on the layer and location. These were not the bones of barnyard herds. They belonged to a world still dominated by wild movement, wild danger, and the skill of hunters who knew how to track, trap, drive, ambush, and process animals without the later security of domesticated flocks. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests gatherings that were not only symbolic, they required a serious supply of meat. A feast in such a world is never just abundance. It is planning made visible. Hunters must know where animals move and when they can be taken. Too few animals, and the gathering loses force. Too many taken carelessly, and future hunts suffer. Meat must be butchered quickly, divided, cooked, dried, roasted, or consumed before it spoils. Bones crack under stone tools for marrow. Hides are removed, tendons, horns, and bones may become useful materials. The smell of smoke, fat, blood, dust, and warm limestone would have mixed around the working areas near the enclosures. Later visitors see only the clean drama of standing pillars, but the living site was likely noisy, physical, and crowded with tasks. One lesser-known detail is how much archaeologists can learn from marks on bone. A cut mark can show where a blade passed through flesh. A fracture pattern can suggest whether bone was broken while fresh. Burning can reveal cooking or disposal. The age and sex of animals may hint at hunting strategies. A concentration of certain body parts can suggest where butchery happened, what was carried away, and what was consumed on site. None of these clues translates directly into a ceremony, and scholars still debate how to connect refused deposits to ritual activity. Yet the bones make one point firmly: the people who came here were feeding bodies as well as imaginations. The tools tell a similar story. Flint blades, scrapers, points, and debris show that skilled stoneworking took place in and around these gatherings. A flint tool is not a crude object when made well. It is the result of trained perception. The maker must see the structure hidden inside the stone, know the angle of force, and strike with controlled confidence. One wrong blow can ruin a core that took effort to obtain. In the world of Göbekli Tepe, flint tools could carve, cut meat. process hides, shape wood, and help work limestone surfaces. They were practical instruments, but they may also have carried social value. A person who could produce sharp blades quickly and reliably had a form of knowledge others depended on. Labour binds these clues together. The raising of pillars is only the most visible part. Someone has to quarry stone, someone has to dress its surface, someone has to carve animals into relief, someone has to gather fuel, bring water, prepare food, clear debris, repair walls, maintain floors, and eventually carry fill when an enclosure is closed. Large monuments create large shadows of labour around them, and much of that labour leaves only broken fragments behind. The mystery is not merely how people lifted stones, it is how they organised the many ordinary tasks that made such lifting possible. This practical side does not weaken the idea of ritual, it strengthens it. A ceremony that requires no effort can end as soon as attention fades. A ceremony that demands food, skilled work, travel, danger, and exhaustion becomes a social force. People remember what they have suffered and contributed. They remember who fed them, who failed to help, who worked skillfully, who claimed honour, and who stood close to the central pillars when the gathering reached its most charged moment. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between feasting, work, and belief. But the ruins suggest that these elements were deeply intertwined. There may also have been competition beneath the cooperation. Feasts can unite people, but they can also rank them. A group able to provide more meat, more grain, better tools, or more workers gains prestige. A skilled hunter may stand higher after a successful drive. A lineage that helps raise a pillar may claim a memory inside the stone. A host who feeds many people may create debts that last beyond the gathering. Early monument building may therefore have been both communal and competitive, both generous and strategic. The old hill may have held unity, but unity in human societies is rarely free of tension. Food traces also bring the landscape into the story. The animals consumed near the hill come from surrounding habitats, and the plants processed nearby connect the site to wider patterns of seasonal use. Every bone and seed fragment is a small map. It shows that the monument was not isolated from the world around it. It depended on hunting grounds, gathering zones, water sources, fuel supplies, and paths of travel. The carved animals on the pillars may represent symbolic beings, but their real counterparts also moved through the same terrain and entered the site as meat, hide, bone, and memory. What survives under the ruins therefore refuses to separate belief from survival. The people who gathered there were not abstract worshippers, and they were not merely practical foragers. They were both at once, as human beings usually are. They built meaning while handling carcasses. They made symbols while sharpening blades. They may have spoken of ancestors, animals, danger, or unseen forces while smoke rose from cooking fires and workers rested with sore hands. The great mystery hidden beneath the ancient mound is not solved by the bones, tools, and food remains, but it becomes more human through them. They show that the first monumental gatherings were made from hunger, skill, obligation, and shared labour as much as from wonder. The stones stand because people believed something mattered, but they also stand because people fed one another long enough to make belief heavy. Beneath the living surfaces of the early settlements, the dead do not always disappear. They remain close, sometimes under floors, sometimes within buildings, sometimes separated into parts that modern observers find difficult to understand without turning too quickly toward horror. In the world around the ancient hill, death is not simply a private ending. It can become part of architecture, memory, and the repeated use of place, the living walk, sleep, work, cook, gather. and rebuild above ground that may also hold ancestors, relatives, enemies, honoured figures, or people whose identities have vanished completely. The boundary between a house, a shrine, a tomb, and a memory can be much thinner than later categories allow. This is one of the most unsettling changes that comes with deeper attachment to place. Mobile groups can bury the dead along routes, in caves, near camps, or in meaningful parts of a landscape. More settled communities face a different question. If people return again and again to the same structures, what happens to the dead who once belonged there? In several early Neolithic settlements across the broader region, archaeologists have found burials beneath floors or within occupation spaces, suggesting that the dead could remain inside the world of the living in a very physical way. The evidence remains incomplete, and practices varied from site to site, but the pattern is powerful enough to change how these communities are imagined. The skull becomes especially important. Across parts of the early Near East, human skulls were sometimes removed, curated, modified, or treated separately from the rest of the body. In later pre-pottery Neolithic contexts, some skulls were even covered with plaster to recreate facial features, though the timing and meaning differ across sites. These practices do not prove one uniform religion, and scholars still debate what they meant. They may have honoured ancestors, preserved the presence of important individuals, marked lineage ties, controlled dangerous dead, or created ritual objects used in ceremonies. They may have done several of these things at once. What survives in the record suggests that the head could hold a special power, not merely as bone, but as identity made durable. At Göbekli Tepe itself, the evidence for human remains is more limited and complex than in some settlement sites, but it is far from absent. Fragments of human bone, including skull pieces showing cut marks and modification, have raised the possibility that the dead played a role in activities connected to the site. Some skull fragments appear to have been worked in ways that suggest deliberate handling after death, though interpreting them requires caution. A cut mark may indicate defleshing, display, preparation, or another act whose emotional meaning is lost. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Still, even a few modified human remains near monumental architecture are enough to suggest that death was not outside the symbolic world of the hill. The carvings seem to echo this unease. Vulture-like birds, headless forms, and dangerous animals appear in the stone imagery, and while it would be too simple to call them direct illustrations of funerary rites, they belong to a mental landscape in which bodies, animals, and transformation may have been closely linked. A vulture consumes flesh and leaves bone. A skull remains after the face is gone. A pillar shaped like a human body but without a face stands as a strange, enduring replacement for the mortal person. These connections are suggestive, not certain. Yet archaeology often works in exactly this way, not by finding a single clear answer, but by placing fragile clues near one another until a lost pattern begins to tremble into view. The dead beneath the living also change the meaning of permanence. A building that contains a burial is no longer only shelter. A floor laid over human remains becomes a surface of memory. Every repair renews not just a structure, but a relationship with those below it. Children may grow up knowing that particular people, or particular kinds of people, lie under certain spaces. Families may claim rights through ancestors buried beneath them. Communities may define belonging through those who remain in the ground. In this sense, the dead can help anchor the living to place as strongly as grain stores or stone walls. To leave a settlement may mean leaving more than a useful location. It may mean leaving the bodies that make the location part of a community's identity. There is a surprising intimacy in this arrangement. Modern people often imagine the dead as removed to cemeteries, separated from houses and daily labour. In many early communities, separation may not have been the goal. The dead could remain nearby, not as ghosts in a sensational sense, but as part of social geography. Their presence may have comforted, warned, legitimized, or obligated the living. The evidence remains incomplete because feelings do not fossilize, but the placement of bodies shows that memory was not always abstract. It had weight, smell, location, and bone. At the same time, these practices may reveal tension rather than simple reverence. Not every burial is equal. Some bodies receive care, others are disturbed. Some heads are kept while other parts are left behind. Some individuals may be remembered, while others vanish into refuse or fill. The treatment of the dead can show hierarchy, fear, exclusion, or changing ritual needs. A skull kept after death may honor a person, but it may also transform that person into an object controlled by the living. Scholars still debate whether these practices were centered on ancestors, enemies, ritual specialists, or broader beliefs about the body and spirit. The uncertainty is not a weakness of the evidence, it is part of the human difficulty of death itself. When the ancient enclosures were eventually filled, the mixture of debris, bones, and stone may have included more than construction waste. If human remains or symbolically charged materials entered the fill, the burial of the monument could have been tied to the burial of memory. The site itself may have become a body of sorts, closed and covered after a life of use. The central pillars, with their carved arms and belts, stood hidden like buried beings inside the mound. Above them, grass grew. People moved on. The dead, the animals, the tools, and the stones all became part of one sealed mass. The mystery under the ruins grows darker here, but also more human. Civilization does not begin only with planting fields or raising walls. It also begins when people decide where the dead belong, how long they should remain present, and what obligations the living owe to those who no longer speak. Beneath floors, inside fills, and in the silent imagery of birds and headless forms, the early communities of this region seem to be wrestling with memory at the moment when place itself becomes more permanent. The dead beneath the living are not a side story. They may be one of the deepest reasons the living stayed. The hill no longer stands alone. For a time, modern attention fixed on Göbekli Tepe as though it were a single impossible flare in the darkness, an isolated place where something extraordinary happened and then vanished. But the landscape around it has begun to answer back. Across the limestone uplands and valleys of southeastern Anatolia, other ancient sites have emerged from the ground, some with T-shaped pillars, carved animals, special buildings, and evidence of gatherings that seem to belong to the same broad world of early monumentality. The mystery widens from one buried mound into an entire region of hidden places. What once looked like an anomaly now begins to resemble a network. This wider region is often discussed under the name Taş Tepeler, the stone hills, a fitting phrase for a landscape where ordinary-looking rises can conceal deep human time. Sites such as Karahan Tepe, Nevala Chori, Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan, and others have shown that the urge to carve, arrange, gather, and mark the land was not confined to a single hilltop. The evidence remains incomplete, because many places are only partly excavated, and some were damaged before modern study could fully understand them. Yet enough has emerged to suggest that early communities across this region shared certain symbolic forms while also developing local variations. The T-shaped pillar was not a one-time invention. It belonged to a broader visual and architectural tradition. Karahan Tepe is especially important because it expands the imagination of what these places could be. There, archaeologists have found carved pillars, sculpted human and animal forms, and unusual spaces that seem to combine architecture with powerful imagery. Some discoveries include human-like heads and a striking chamber with carved elements that feel both bodily and architectural, though interpretations remain cautious and debated. The site suggests that the people of this region were not merely copying one sacred formula, they were experimenting with forms, spaces, and symbols in ways that may have reflected different communities, different ceremonies, or different moments in a changing world. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety now appearing across the stone hills. The network changes the meaning of Göbekli Tepe itself. If one site exists, it might be a unique ceremonial centre, drawing people from a very wide region. If many related sites exist, then the social landscape becomes more complex. Perhaps communities had their own gathering places, linked by shared imagery and seasonal movement. Perhaps certain sites held different roles, some more central, others more local. Perhaps groups travelled between them, carrying stories, techniques, marriage ties, obligations, and rivalries. A carved fox at one place may not mean exactly the same thing as a carved fox at another, but the repetition suggests that people recognized a common symbolic world. They were not isolated bands inventing meaning alone. They were part of a larger conversation written in stone. This is one of the most surprising details of the region. Its monuments appear before the familiar signs of later urban complexity, yet they may already show a kind of cultural connectedness that stretches beyond a single settlement. Shared forms do not require an empire. They can travel through gatherings, marriages, apprenticeships, seasonal hunts, feasts, and ritual obligations. A skilled carver may work at more than one site. A group may bring a symbol from its home territory to a larger meeting place. Young people may learn stories that attach animals, stones, and ancestors to places they have not yet visited. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern hints at a world rich in movement and memory. The landscape itself encourages connection. The Upper Mesopotamian region sits near zones of ecological diversity, where plains, hills, river valleys, and uplands create different opportunities within reachable distances. Wild grains grow in some areas. Herd animals move through others. Flint sources, water, woodland, and hunting grounds are not evenly distributed. People who know how to use such a landscape must also know how to move through relationships. Access to resources may depend on kinship, alliance, ritual hospitality, or negotiated rights. Monumental sites may have helped stabilize these relationships by giving dispersed groups places to meet under shared rules. Yet the same network may also have carried tension. Shared symbols do not always mean peace. Communities can cooperate and compete through the same traditions. One site may try to outdo another in pillar size, carving skill, feasting scale, or ritual prestige. A group that commands a more impressive gathering place may gain influence. A lineage connected to a powerful enclosure may claim authority. A feast may welcome outsiders while quietly reminding them who controls the center. Scholars still debate how hierarchical these societies were, but the monuments make it difficult to imagine a world without status, ambition, and social negotiation. Even before chiefs and kings become visible, prestige may already be gathering around stone. The discovery of multiple sites also helps explain why the burial of one place did not mean the end of the tradition. If enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were closed, people may have continued similar practices elsewhere, or transformed them into new forms. A monument could be buried while the broader symbolic world lived on. Traditions rarely die all at once. They migrate, shrink, expand, and take on new shapes. What looks like disappearance in one mound may be part of movement across a region. The old hill may have been one node in a living landscape rather than the whole of the mystery. This wider view makes the question more difficult, but also more truthful. The 10,000-year-old mystery is not hidden under one ruin only. It lies beneath a whole region, where early communities seem to have been inventing new ways to gather, remember, compete, and belong. Each site adds a fragment, but none completes the picture. Some preserve pillars, others preserve carvings, some suggest communal buildings, others hint at domestic life nearby. Some were drowned, damaged, or only partly understood. The record is uneven, like a broken map whose surviving pieces show roads leading beyond the edge. Still, the pattern is unmistakable enough to shift the story. Before the first cities of Mesopotamia rise on the southern plains, before writing fixes speech into clay, before kings claim that gods have chosen them, the uplands to the north are already filled with places where people shape stone into social memory. These stone hills show that the roots of civilization may not lie in one sudden centre, but in a scattered constellation of gatherings. Under these hills, ancient communities left evidence of a world where belief, labour, landscape, and identity were already being organised on a scale larger than the household. Göbekli Tepe remains extraordinary, but it is no longer lonely. Around it, the buried land has begun to reveal that the mystery was shared. The end of these monumental places does not look like the fall of a kingdom. There are no burned palace archives, no royal statues smashed by invaders, no armies marching through gates, no written lament for a city left in ruins. The world of the stone hills fades before the usual language of collapse can easily apply. There is no empire here to fragment, no dynasty to lose legitimacy, no taxation system to fail, no capital whose destruction becomes the symbol of an age ending. Yet something does change. Enclosures are filled. Some places are abandoned or transformed. The great T-shaped pillars no longer dominate the living surface in the same way. A tradition that once demanded immense labour and attention gradually loses its central role, leaving behind covered spaces, broken carvings, and the sense of a powerful idea withdrawing underground. This kind of ending is harder to explain because it is quiet. Later collapses often leave dramatic evidence fire layers, mass graves, defensive walls, sudden breaks in trade goods, or texts describing famine and invasion. Here, the signs are subtler. The burial of enclosures suggests deliberate closure, but closure is not the same as catastrophe. People may have continued living nearby. They may have carried old symbols into new forms. They may have shifted their gatherings to other places or changed the kinds of buildings they considered important. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether the fading of the monumental tradition was sudden, gradual, local, regional, ritual, practical, or all of these at once. All of. One possibility is that the social world that created the monuments changed too much to sustain them. Large hilltop enclosures may have made sense in a landscape of mobile or semi-mobile groups, gathering periodically for ceremony, feasting, alliance, and memory. But as communities became more settled, their centres of gravity may have moved. The house, the village, the storage room, the field. And the burial beneath the floor may have become more important than the distant or elevated ceremonial enclosure. Ritual did not disappear. It may have moved inward, into the settlement, into domestic architecture, into ancestor practices, into smaller communal buildings, into forms less visible from a distance, but more deeply woven into daily life. This is a crucial point. The end of a one kind of monument does not mean the end of belief. It may mean belief has changed its address. A world that once gathers around enormous pillars on a hill may later gather around other spaces, special houses, plastered rooms, burial areas, shrines inside settlements, or open places whose traces are harder to identify. As people live longer in one place, ritual may no longer need to draw dispersed groups across the landscape in the same way. The sacred can become more local, more domestic, more tied to lineage, storage, and household memory. No single explanation fully accounts for this shift, but the changing pattern of architecture suggests that the social needs of ritual were being rearranged. Food may have played a role as well. The rise of cultivation and early farming changes not only what people eat, but how time and labour are organised. Fields require attention, stored food requires protection, settlements require maintenance. Animals, once domesticated, create new daily obligations. The old rhythm of large seasonal gatherings may have become more difficult as people's labour became tied to specific places at specific times. A community invested in crops cannot move as lightly. A household guarding stored grain cannot leave for long without risk. The very developments that may have helped support monument building could eventually make that form of monument less practical. There is also the pressure of population. As more people cluster in settlements, social life becomes denser and perhaps more difficult. Monumental gatherings may once have helped manage relationships across dispersed groups, but settled villages create new problems of authority, conflict, property, inheritance, and belonging. The public labour of raising pillars may no longer be the best way to negotiate status. New forms of power may emerge through control of food, access to land, household size, ancestry, craft skill, or exchange networks. The old hilltop enclosure, once central to social life, may become less useful in a world where influence is increasingly rooted in the everyday structures of settlement. Climate and environment may have added further pressure, though they cannot explain everything alone. The early Holocene was not a simple paradise of steady abundance. Rainfall patterns changed, habitats shifted, animal populations responded to hunting, vegetation, and climate. Wild resources that once supported large gatherings may have become less predictable in some areas. If feast depended heavily on wild game, changes in animal availability could have weakened the tradition. If communities relied more on cultivated plants, their symbolic world may have gradually turned away from the untamed animals carved so fiercely into the old pillars. Scholars still debate the balance between environmental pressure and social transformation, but both likely shape the world in which the monuments lost their urgency. The burial of the enclosures may therefore mark not collapse in the dramatic sense, but replacement, a ritual order built around wild animals, great stones, and periodic gatherings gives way to a different order built around settlement, cultivation, ancestry, and the management of stored life. The old monuments may have become relics of a way of being that no longer fit. Covering them could have been respectful, practical, symbolic, or necessary. It may have sealed a dangerous past, honoured a completed cycle, cleared space, or transformed the hill into a mound of memory. What survives in the record suggests intention, but not motive. The hands that buried the pillars did not explain themselves. There is something deeply human in that. Civilizations are not the only things that end. Traditions end, gatherings end, ways of seeing animals, stone, death, and place end or change beyond recognition. A community can survive while its deepest rituals disappear. A landscape can remain inhabited while the meaning of its most powerful places is forgotten. The stone hills remind us that collapse does not always arrive with smoke on the horizon. Sometimes it comes as a change in habit, a shift in attention, a new food economy, a different relationship with the dead, a younger generation that no longer needs the old enclosure open to the sky. Long before empire, there is already loss, not the loss recorded by scribes, but the quieter loss of forms that no longer fit the world being born. Beneath the mound, the pillars remain upright, as if waiting for the return of people who never came back in the same way. Above them, settlement life continues elsewhere. Farming spreads, villages deepen, and the first long road towards cities slowly opens. The old tradition does not fail like a defeated kingdom. It sinks into the ground, carrying with it a memory of the time when human beings gathered around wild animals in stone and began to discover both the power and the burden of staying together. The most tempting explanation is always the simplest one. A great stone enclosure looks like a temple, so people call it a temple. A hilltop filled with animal carvings looks sacred, so people imagine priests. A buried monument seems mysterious, so the mind reaches for a single hidden cause that will make every pillar, bone, skull fragment, feast, and layer of rubble fall neatly into place. But the deeper the evidence is studied, the less obedient it becomes. The old ruins do not offer one clean answer. They offer overlapping possibilities, each strong in some places and weak in others. Religion, social cooperation, feasting, climate change, early farming, ancestor memory, competition, and identity all seem to touch the mystery, but none can fully possess it. The religious explanation remains powerful because the architecture itself feels set apart from ordinary life. The enclosures are formal, planned, and symbolically charged. Their central pillars rise like presences rather than supports. Their carvings are too intense to be treated as casual ornament. Their spaces seem designed for gathering, focus, and perhaps restricted access. What survives in the record suggests that people came there for more than shelter or tool-making. Yet calling the place religious can hide as much as it reveals. Religion in a world before writing, before formal temples, and before known priestly institutions may not resemble later religion at all. It may be inseparable from hunting, death, food, seasonal movement, and group memory. Scholars still debate whether the word temple is useful or misleading, because it imports expectations from later societies that may not fit the earliest builders. The social cooperation theory explains another part of the puzzle. Large monuments require people to work together beyond the scale of a single household. The building of pillars may have created alliances among scattered groups, giving them a shared project and a shared memory. Under this view, the hill is not only a sacred place but a social machine. It turns labour into belonging. It makes people cooperate, eat together, recognise common symbols, and remember themselves as part of something wider. This explanation has great strength because it accounts for the energy invested in construction. Yet it still leaves a question behind. Cooperation usually needs a reason strong enough to overcome conflict, fatigue, and the desire to spend effort elsewhere. The monument may create community, but some shared belief or pressure must first make the monument worth building. Feasting offers a bridge between belief and social life. The bones of wild animals, the evidence of food processing, and the scale of gathering all suggest that eating together mattered. A feast can turn strangers into allies, rivals into temporary partners, and labourers into honoured participants. It can also create prestige for hosts and obligations for guests. In this view, the great enclosures may have been stages for events where food, work, symbol, and social ranking came together. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, but feasting helps explain how mobile or semi-mobile groups could be gathered repeatedly. Still, feasting alone does not explain the strange power of the carvings or the careful arrangement of the pillars. People can feast without building a world of stone animals and faceless human forms. Climate pressure is another part of the debate. The end of the Ice Age brings environmental change across Western Asia, and communities must adjust to new distributions of plants, animals, and water. In some periods, abundance may have encouraged gathering, In others, instability may have pushed people toward cooperation, storage, and new subsistence strategies. Climate can make certain choices more likely. It can open landscapes, reduce old resources, or encourage the use of new ones. Yet climate does not carve foxes. It does not decide that two central pillars should stand facing one another. Environmental change sets conditions, but human beings give those conditions form. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is too simple to say that the monuments were built because the weather changed. The weather changed, and people answered through culture. The farming explanation is perhaps the most famous because it touches the old story of civilization. For generations, farming was seen as the foundation that made monuments possible. Settled agricultural life created surplus, and surplus supported ritual specialists, builders, and public architecture. But the stone hills complicate this order. Monumental gathering appears during a time when agriculture is emerging, but not yet fully dominant in the region. This has led to the intriguing possibility that ritual helped encourage farming, rather than simply resulting from it. If ceremonies and feasts required reliable supplies, people may have intensified the harvesting and management of wild cereals. If gatherings made certain places socially important, people may have stayed closer to them. The idea is persuasive, but it cannot be stretched into a single law. Farming emerged differently in different places, through many small changes rather than one sudden cause. Ancestor memory adds another layer: the handling of skulls, the presence of human-like pillars, the possible connections between death imagery and burial practices all suggest that the dead may have mattered deeply. The pillars themselves, with carved arms and belts but no faces, may have represented beings beyond ordinary humans' ancestors, spirits, powerful presences, or categories of personhood no modern word captures well. Yet this explanation also remains uncertain. Not every enclosure contains clear evidence of funerary activity. Not every animal carving points toward death. The dead may have been one part of the symbolic system rather than its whole centre. Still, in a world becoming more attached to place, ancestors would have offered a powerful way to claim continuity. A community that remembers its dead in stone can make belonging feel ancient, even when the new way of life is still forming. Competition may be the least comfortable explanation, but it is difficult to avoid. Cooperation and rivalry often grow together. A group that builds a larger enclosure, hosts a greater feast, carves more impressive pillars, or controls access to a respected site gains prestige. Monumentality can express unity while quietly producing hierarchy. People may gather as equals in theory and leave with different levels of honour in practice. The evidence for formal social ranking at these early sites remains debated, but social difference does not need crowns to exist. Influence can gather around skill, memory, generosity, ritual knowledge, or control of important places. The first monuments may have been both communal achievements and arenas of subtle power. The truth may be that the modern desire for one explanation is itself the problem. These ruins belong to a world where practical and symbolic life were not separate. A hunt could be food, prestige, danger, and myth. A feast could be nutrition, alliance, debt, and ceremony. A skull could be bone, ancestor, warning, and object. A pillar could be architecture, being, memory, and social proof. The categories that make analysis easier may not describe how the builders experienced their own world. What survives in the record suggests a dense knot of motives rather than a straight line. So the competing explanations remain, not as failures, but as windows. Religion explains the intensity, cooperation explains the labour, feasting explains the gatherings, Climate explains the pressure, farming explains the changing economy, ancestors explain the pull of memory, competition explains the emergence of prestige. None is enough alone, and together they do not solve the mystery completely. They reveal something more interesting. The beginning of civilization was not a single invention, but a convergence. Beneath the ancient ruins, the human future is being assembled from hunger, fear, imagination, weather, death, ambition, and the astonishing ability of people to stand together before a stone and agree that it means something. The later cities of Mesopotamia seem, at first, to belong to another universe. They rise on river plains where canals cut through fields, mud brick walls enclose neighborhoods, temples stand on platforms, administrators press signs into clay, and rulers place themselves between the human world and the divine. By the time Uruk, Eridu, and other urban centers become powerful, the old hilltop enclosures of southeastern Anatolia are already ancient. Their pillars are buried. Their builders are nameless. Their animal symbols belong to a world that has mostly vanished from daily life. Yet the distance between them is not as absolute as it appears. Under the first cities lies a deeper inheritance, the habit of gathering people around marked places, turning memory into architecture, and making stone, earth, and symbol carry meanings larger than a single lifetime. Civilization does not emerge from a blank beginning. It grows from earlier experiments, many of them small, fragile, and only partly preserved. The first villages teach people how to live with neighbors year after year. Stored food teaches them to think about surplus, scarcity, debt, and control. Burials beneath floors teach them that place can hold ancestry. Communal buildings teach them that some spaces belong to more than one household. Feasts teach them how generosity can become authority. Monumental enclosures teach them that labor can be organized around invisible obligations. Scholars still debate the exact pathways from early Neolithic villages to later urban states, but the roots of the city reach down into these older habits. The ruins beneath the mound matter because they reveal complexity before bureaucracy. Later civilizations make power visible through writing, seals, ration lists, temples, royal graves, and fortifications. The stone hills offer almost none of those familiar signs. There is no evidence of a state in the later sense. No archive records grain moving from farmer to temple. No official title names a priest or chief. Yet people are already coordinating labor, repeating symbolic forms, returning to special places, and embedding social memory in architecture. The ability to make people act together around a shared idea may precede the institutions that later claim to control shared ideas. This is one reason the old ruins unsettle the history of temples. In the later Near East, temples become economic centers as well as sacred ones. They own land, store goods, organize offerings, and connect earthly authority to divine order. It would be wrong to project that entire system backward onto Göbekli Tepe. The evidence remains incomplete, and the early enclosures do not show the administrative machinery of later temple institutions. Still, they suggest that the emotional and social power of special architecture came first. Before temples become bureaucratic engines, there are places where people gather because the space itself seems charged. Before gods are named in texts, there are pillars and ceremonies that give architecture a presence beyond shelter. The same is true of hierarchy. Kings do not appear suddenly from nowhere. They are the extreme visible form of older differences in status, persuasion, ritual knowledge, control of food, and command of memory. At the ancient hill, there is no proof of kingship, and it would be misleading to invent rulers where the evidence does not show them. but the labour behind the monuments suggests leadership of some kind. Someone knows the plan. Someone remembers the proper form. Someone can call others to work, or persuade them, or obligate them through kinship, ritual, debt, or prestige. Such authority may be temporary, situational, and shared, unlike later kingship. Yet it reveals a seed of something that later states will grow into harder structures. The carved pillars also foreshadow a long human habit making the invisible stand upright. Later civilizations fill their cities with statues, stela, boundary stones, altars, tomb markers, and temple images. They use durable forms to hold things that cannot be held, otherwise divine presence. Royal legitimacy, ancestral memory, victory, law, identity, grief. The T-shaped pillars belong to an earlier version of this impulse. They are not statues in the familiar later sense, but they seem to turn personhood, power, or presence into architecture. Without faces, they are not portraits of individuals. They are something broader, perhaps categories of beings, ancestors, ritual presences, or symbolic persons whose meaning is now lost. This continuity should not be overstated. The people of the Stone Hills are not simply early Sumerians waiting to happen. Their world is different in economy, scale, environment, and social form. The wild animals carved on their pillars do not lead in a straight line to later city gods. The burial of their enclosures does not explain ziggurats. History is not a neat staircase. Traditions break, vanish, merge, and reappear in altered forms. What survives in the record suggests both connection and rupture. The old monumental world shows that some ingredients of civilization existed early, but it does not erase the originality of later cities. What it does change is the question. Instead of asking when civilization suddenly began, the ruins force a slower and more unsettling question. How did human beings become capable of believing in large shared worlds? A city is not only a concentration of houses, it is a concentration of trust, coercion, habit, story, and expectation. People accept that certain spaces matter more than others, that certain symbols bind them, that certain dead remain important, that certain leaders can command attention. The Stone Hills show these capacities emerging before the city, still tied to wild animals, seasonal gatherings, and the unresolved edge between foraging and farming. The mystery under civilization is therefore not a hidden lost empire. It is older and more difficult. It is the moment when human communities begin to discover that meaning can organize labor as powerfully as hunger does. A field feeds people, but a symbol can gather them. A storehouse preserves grain, but a monument preserves obligation. Later civilizations will turn these discoveries into temples, states, laws, armies, and myths of kingship. At the beginning, they may have been no more than people walking toward a hill where carved animals waited in stone. That is why the buried enclosures still matter long after their builders disappear. They are not the first city, not the first kingdom, not the first temple in the later institutional sense. They are something earlier, a glimpse of the deep machinery beneath all those later forms. Before civilization writes its own history, people are already learning how to make places sacred, how to make labor collective, how to make memory durable, and how to let stone speak for things too large or too dangerous to leave unmarked. What the ruins still hide may be more important than what they have already revealed. The exposed pillars, carved animals, stone benches, quarry traces, and layers of fill have changed the story of early civilization, but they are only fragments of a larger buried world. Much of the ancient hill remains unexcavated, and the wider landscape of the Stone Hills is still only partly understood. Beneath the soil, there may be more enclosures, more carvings, more human remains, more evidence of feasts, more traces of buildings that blur the line between ritual and daily life. Every trench opens a window, but it also reminds researchers how much remains outside the frame. The evidence remains incomplete, and in a place like this, incompleteness is not a minor inconvenience. It is the condition of the mystery itself. Archaeology moves carefully here because excavation is also destruction. Once soil is removed, the original sealed context can never be put back exactly as it was. A buried layer is a kind of archive, but it can be read only by taking it apart. That means each decision matters. Where to dig, what to leave untouched, what to sample, what to preserve for future methods not yet invented. Earlier generations of archaeologists sometimes remove material quickly in search of spectacular objects. Modern work is slower, more patient, and often more humble. A fragment of charcoal can anchor a date. A microscopic plant remain can change ideas about food. Chemical traces in sediments can reveal activity that leaves no visible artifact. A surface that looks empty may hold residues of movement, burning, plastering, or decay. The old hill still has many such quiet records locked in place. This is one of the lesser-known truths about ancient mysteries. The biggest answers may not come from the larger stones. They may come from pollen, starch grains, phytoliths, animal tooth enamel, use wear on flint, ancient DNA if preservation allows, or soil chemistry that shows where people stood, cooked, worked, or dumped refuse. A carved pillar can tell us that symbols mattered. A seed can tell us what season people gathered. A bone can tell us what they ate, how they hunted. And whether animals were wild or beginning to fall under human control, a tiny cut mark on a skull can reopen the question of death. The future of this 10,000-year-old mystery may depend as much on microscopes as on excavation picks. Yet there are questions that may never receive final answers. No method can easily recover the exact words spoken in an enclosure, the gestures made around a pillar, the fear or awe people felt when they entered, or the full meaning of a fox carved into stone. Archaeology can narrow possibilities, strengthen some interpretations, weaken others, and reveal patterns no one expected. It can show that a place was built before full agriculture, that wild animals dominated the imagery, that enclosures were filled, that people gathered, ate, worked, and perhaps remembered the dead there. But the inner world of belief is harder to reach. Scholars still debate whether these places were temples, communal houses, ancestor centres, feasting grounds, ritual theatres, territorial markers, or something that combines parts of all those categories without matching any of them exactly. That uncertainty should not be treated as failure. It is one of the reasons the site remains so powerful. A mystery is not valuable because it permits any answer. It is valuable when the evidence is strong enough to demand attention, but incomplete enough to resist simplification. Unsupported fantasies sometimes rush into such gaps, imagining lost super-civilizations, impossible technologies, or outside teachers where no solid evidence requires them. The mainstream story is more difficult and more interesting. Human beings themselves, living before cities and kings, were capable of planning, carving, gathering, symbolizing, remembering, and transforming their world. The ruins do not need impossible explanations. Their real implications are already astonishing. The greatest change brought by these buried places may be the collapse of an old confidence. For a long time, civilization was often imagined as a ladder farming first, then surplus, then villages, then temples, then cities, then writing, then history. The stone hills do not destroy that sequence entirely. but they make it less rigid. They show that ritual and monumentality may have helped shape settlement and farming, not merely followed them. They reveal that complex symbolic life can organize labour before the rise of state power. They suggest that the desire to gather around shared meaning is not a luxury produced after survival is secured, but one of the forces that helps redefine survival itself. This matters far beyond one hill in Anatolia. It changes how the human past is imagined. It asks us to see prehistoric people not as simple ancestors waiting for civilization to improve them, but as communities making difficult choices within changing environments, creating worlds of meaning that were rich, unstable, and sometimes lost. It reminds us that writing is not the beginning of human depth. Cities are not the beginning of social imagination. Kings are not the beginning of authority. Long before those things, people already carried complicated memories, made obligations visible, and built places that outlived them. The ruins still hide their final answers, and perhaps they always will. Future excavations may transform the picture again. New dates may adjust the timeline. New sites may show that the network was larger than suspected. New analyses may reveal patterns of diet, movement, ancestry, and craft that sharpen the story. But there will always remain a silence at the centre, the silence left by people who made no written explanation for what they built. In that silence, the pillars stand more powerfully. They do not tell us everything. They tell us enough to disturb the old story and enough to invite a new one. Beneath the mound, under layers of stone and time, the ancient builders remain just out of reach. Their world is not ours, yet it is not entirely alien. They gather, labour, eat, fear, death. Remember the dead, watch animals, mark places, and create meanings strong enough to move stone. The mystery hidden under the ruins is not only what they believed, it is how close they stand to the beginning of the world we still inhabit, the world where people build around ideas, bury their pasts, and leave future generations to wonder what was meant. The story slows here, as the wind moves again over the hill and the stones return to silence. The modern visitor sees fences, excavation shelters, careful pathways, and the exposed shapes of a place rescued from deep burial. But beyond the visible ruins, the old landscape continues in all directions. Fields, roads, villages, and distant horizons cover a region where people once moved by animal paths, ripening grasses, remembered springs, and obligations that left no writing behind. The ancient builders are gone, and even the descendants of their traditions have vanished into other traditions, other languages, other ways of living. Yet something remains in the ground, and something remains in the human habit of return. We still go back to old places hoping they will explain us. We still stand before stones and ask why they were raised. We still build monuments to hold what cannot be held in ordinary speech grief, belonging, fear, power, hope, and the desire not to disappear completely. The people of the Stone Hills did this before the first cities had names. They did it with limestone, wild animals, shared labour, and a vision we can only partly recover. Their ruins remind us that civilization is fragile not because stone falls, but because meaning changes. A place can be sacred for centuries and then become a mound under grass. A ritual can gather generations and then fade from memory. A symbol once known to everyone can become an animal shape no one can read. Human worlds do not vanish only in fire and invasion. Sometimes they vanish gently, as people stop returning, as children learn different stories, as fields replace hunting grounds, as houses and villages draw life away from older hills. And still, the buried pillars waited. They waited through dust, weather, silence, and the long sleep of unrecorded time. When they rose again into daylight, They didn't give back the voices of their makers, but they returned a deeper truth that the beginning of civilization was not clean, simple, or inevitable. It was uncertain, experimental, and profoundly human. Somewhere in that ancient landscape, people stood together before carved animals and faceless stones, not knowing they were changing the future. Above them was the open sky. Around them was the wild world. Beneath them, slowly and without a name, history was beginning to root itself in the earth.